Motorcyclist kicks dogs for fun, unaware that one of them belongs to a police officer. Detective Jake Miller cherished these rare moments of tranquility. The autumn breeze rustled through the park's trees as he walked alongside his wife Emily, their two beloved dachshunds Buddy and Daisy, trotting happily ahead of them. These peaceful walks had become their sacred ritual, a chance to disconnect from the daily pressures of life and spend quality time together as a family. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us from which city you're watching us. We'll keep going. Emily's gentle laugh echoed through the air as Buddy attempted to chase a fallen leaf, his short legs working overtime to keep up with his enthusiasm. Daisy, ever the more reserved of the pair, stayed closer to Emily, occasionally glancing up at her with devoted eyes. Jake couldn't help but smile at the simple joy of the moment. "You know," Emily said, threading her arm through his, "we should do this more often. The dogs love it, and honestly, I've missed having you all to myself." Jake squeezed her hand in agreement. His job as a detective often meant long hours and unpredictable schedules, making these peaceful moments all the more precious. He was about to respond when the roar of approaching motorcycles shattered their serenity. Two riders, their leather vests emblazoned with the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club emblem, sped past them, their engines deliberately revving louder as they passed. Chuck and Roy, as Jake would later learn their names to be, circled back around, this time slower, hurling insults and taunting their dogs. Jake felt Emily tense beside him, her grip on the leashes tightening as Buddy and Daisy began to bark anxiously. He maintained his composure, years of experience having taught him the value of staying calm in tense situations. However, the situation escalated when one of the riders, Chuck, suddenly swerved closer and kicked out at Buddy, causing the small dog to yelp in pain. Emily gasped, immediately kneeling to check on Buddy while Daisy barked frantically. Jake's instincts kicked in, but he kept his response measured. His trained eye caught every detail: the distinctive patches on their vests, the customization on their bikes, and most importantly, the smug expressions on their faces as they circled once more before speeding away. "Are you both okay?" Jake asked, kneeling beside Emily and the dogs. Emily nodded, though her hands were shaking slightly as she comforted Buddy, who seemed more startled than hurt. "Who were those men?" Emily asked, her voice steady despite her evident concern. "They seemed to be deliberately trying to provoke us." Jake helped her up, his mind already working through the implications of what had just happened. "Let's get home," he said quietly, keeping a protective arm around her as they walked. "I don't like how they were sizing us up." The walk home was tense, their earlier peaceful mood completely shattered. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a random encounter. The way those riders had circled back, their deliberate provocations, it felt calculated, almost as if they were testing boundaries. Once home, Jake made sure Emily and the dogs were safely inside before pulling out his phone. He had contacts in the local police force, who might be able to tell him more about the Iron Wolves. As he waited for responses to his inquiries, he watched through the window as Emily settled the dogs in their favorite spots in the living room, Buddy already seeming to have forgotten the incident as he dozed in a patch of sunlight. But Jake couldn't forget. His instincts, honed by years of detective work, told him this was just the beginning. The Iron Wolves' reputation preceded them, and while they weren't known for random acts of violence, their presence in the neighborhood was concerning. He needed to understand why they had chosen to target his family on what should have been a peaceful Sunday afternoon. Emily approached him as he stood by the window, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind. "You're worried," she said. It wasn't a question. "Just being cautious," Jake replied, turning to face her. "I'm going to make some calls, see what I can find out about our new friends." "Just promise me you won't do anything rash," Emily said, knowing her husband's protective nature. "We don't need this turning into something bigger than it is." Jake nodded, but in his gut he knew it already was bigger than it appeared. The Iron Wolves didn't do anything without a reason, and he intended to find out exactly what that reason was. The next few days passed with an unsettling quiet that did nothing to ease Jake's concerns. His preliminary investigation into the Iron Wolves had revealed a pattern of intimidation and illegal trading activities that made him increasingly uneasy. Chuck and Roy, the two riders who had confronted them in the park, had a history of harassment and vandalism, that suggested they enjoyed causing trouble. Emily tried to maintain their normal routine, but Jake noticed how she would check the street before taking Buddy and Daisy out for their walks, always during daylight hours now. The dogs, too, seemed more alert, Daisy especially growing tense at the sound of approaching motorcycles. On Wednesday afternoon, everything changed. Emily was preparing dinner when her phone buzzed with a message. Jake watched as the color drained from her face. "Emily?" he asked, crossing the kitchen in 2 quick strides. "What is it?" She wordlessly handed him the phone. On the screen was a photo of their house, clearly taken that day, with a message that made Jake's blood run cold. "Nice place you got here. Shame if anything happened to it." "They've been watching us," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of Buddy and Daisy playing in the next room. "Jake, what do they want?" Jake pulled her close, his mind racing through possibilities. The Iron Wolves weren't known for random targeting. There had to be a reason they'd singled out his family. "I'm going to increase our security," he said, already mentally listing the improvements needed. New locks, security cameras, the works. But he knew physical security measures weren't enough. He needed to address the root of the problem, and that meant confronting the Iron Wolves directly. The question was how to do it without escalating the situation further. That evening, after making sure Emily and the dogs were secure inside, Jake made a series of calls to his contacts in law enforcement. Each conversation added another piece to the puzzle of who the Iron Wolves really were, and more importantly, who led them. Pri, the club's leader, emerged as a key figure in Jake's investigation. Unlike Chuck and Roy, Pri was described as charismatic but principled, someone who maintained order within his organization and, surprisingly, valued community relations. This information gave Jake an idea. "I don't like this," Emily said, when he told her his plan to visit the Iron Wolves clubhouse. She sat on their living room couch, absently stroking Daisy's fur while Buddy dozed at her feet. "These aren't reasonable people, Jake. They threatened our home." "Pri isn't like Chuck and Roy," Jake explained, sitting beside her. "From what I've learned, he runs a tight ship. The Iron Wolves have a code, and what those two did, harassing us, threatening you, that goes against it." Emily looked unconvinced. "And you think he'll just listen to you? A stranger walking into their territory?" "I think he'll listen to reason," Jake replied, though he understood her skepticism. "If nothing else, he'll want to know that 2 of his members are acting in ways that could bring unwanted attention to the club." As they discussed the risks and possibilities, Jake's phone buzzed with another message from his contacts. This one contained information about recent tensions within the Iron Wolves. Apparently, Chuck and Roy had been pushing boundaries for weeks, causing problems that Pri had been working to contain. "There's something bigger going on here," Jake mused, showing Emily the message. "Chuck and Roy's behavior. It's like they're deliberately trying to provoke a response." "But why us?" Emily leaned against him, her worry evident in the tension of her shoulders. "Just be careful," she said finally. "Whatever you decide to do, remember you have us to come home to." Jake squeezed her hand, watching as Buddy stretched in his sleep, paws twitching as he chased dream rabbits. The sight strengthened his resolve. He would protect his family, but he would do it smart, not with force. The next morning, Jake began preparing for his visit to the Iron Wolves clubhouse. He carefully chose civilian clothes that wouldn't immediately mark him as law enforcement, but would command respect. As he got ready, Emily watched from their bedroom doorway, Buddy and Daisy at her feet. "I still think this is dangerous," she said, but her voice had lost its earlier edge of panic. "But I trust you. Just promise me you'll be careful." Jake crossed the room and kissed her forehead. "I promise. This ends today, one way or another." What he didn't tell her was that he had already set up a backup plan, alerting trusted colleagues to be ready if things went wrong. But as he headed out, Jake was confident in his approach. Sometimes the best way to diffuse a situation wasn't through force or threats, but through understanding and appealing to someone's sense of honor. The Iron Wolves clubhouse stood at the edge of town, a converted warehouse that managed to look both imposing and unremarkable at the same time. Jake parked his car a block away, taking a moment to observe the activity around the building. Several motorcycles were parked outside, their chrome gleaming in the late morning sun. As Jake approached, he noticed how the casual conversations among the members outside suddenly ceased. All eyes turned to him, evaluating, assessing. He maintained his steady pace, projecting confidence without aggression. A tall man with a salt and pepper beard stepped forward, blocking his path. "Private property," the man growled, though his tone held more warning than threat. "I'm here to see Prey," Jake stated calmly, maintaining eye contact. "It's about Chuck and Roy." The mention of those names caused a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The guard exchanged glances with another member, who disappeared inside the clubhouse. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few minutes, the door opened again. Prey emerged, his presence immediately commanding attention. Unlike the theatrical tough guy image Jake had expected, Prey carried himself with a quiet authority that spoke of genuine leadership. His dark eyes studied Jake with intelligent curiosity. "You're either very brave or very foolish," Prey said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet yard. "Coming here alone." Jake met his gaze steadily. "I'm here because we have a mutual problem. Two of them, actually." Prey's expression didn't change, but he gestured for Jake to follow him inside. The clubhouse interior was surprisingly well maintained, with a bar area, comfortable seating, and what appeared to be a meeting room off to the side. Prey led him there, closing the door behind them. "Talk," Prey commanded, settling into a chair at the head of a long table. Jake remained standing, carefully choosing his words. "Chuck and Roy have been causing problems in my neighborhood. They threatened my family, sent messages with photos of our house. That's not just harassment, that's asking for attention nobody here wants." Prey's eyes narrowed slightly. "And why should this concern me?" "Because they're wearing your colors while they do it," Jake replied. "And from what I understand, that's not how the Iron Wolves operate. You have a code." A flicker of surprise crossed Prey's face, quickly masked. "You've done your homework, but you still haven't told me who you are." Jake weighed his options carefully before responding. "I'm someone who could make things very difficult for your club if I wanted to, but I'm also someone who believes in handling things the right way first." Prey leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "The right way? You keep order in your club. I respect that. Chuck and Roy, they're not just disrespecting my family, they're disrespecting everything you've built here." The room fell silent as Prey considered Jake's words. Outside, the rumble of motorcycles and muffled conversations created a distant backdrop to the tension in the room. Finally, Prey stood up. "Wait here," he commanded, leaving the room. Jake could hear raised voices outside, though the words were indistinct. Several minutes later, the door opened again. Prey returned, followed by Chuck and Roy, both looking defiant, but with an undercurrent of nervousness. "These are serious accusations," Prey said, his voice carrying an edge of authority that made both men straighten up. "Threatening families. Taking pictures of their homes. That's not what we do." Chuck stepped forward, his face flushed. "He's lying. We were just having some fun with the dogs." "Enough," Prey's voice cracked like a whip. "You've been pushing boundaries for weeks. Now, I find out you're targeting innocent families." He turned to Roy, who had remained suspiciously quiet. "And you?" "Nothing to say." Roy shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. Prey's expression hardened as he reached a decision. In a swift motion, he stepped forward and removed the club rings from both men's fingers. "You're out," he declared, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Turn in your vests and leave. You're no longer Iron Wolves." The shock on Chuck and Roy's faces quickly transformed into anger, but before they could protest, several other club members appeared in the doorway, making it clear that resistance would be unwise. As the former members were escorted out, Prey turned back to Jake. "It's done, but you should know, men like that, they don't take humiliation well. Watch your back." Jake nodded, understanding both the warning and the implicit message that Prey had done all he would do. As he left the clubhouse, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that while one problem had been solved, another had just begun. Chuck and Roy were now loose cannons, with nothing left to lose and every reason to seek revenge. The expulsion from the Iron Wolves only seemed to fuel Chuck and Roy's determination. Within days, their presence in Jake's neighborhood became impossible to ignore. Their motorcycles would appear at random times, parked strategically around the block, their engines deliberately revving in the early hours of the morning. Emily noticed the change in their community almost immediately. Neighbors who usually chatted freely on their front lawns now hurried inside when they heard approaching motorcycles. The local coffee shop, where she often worked on her laptop, had fewer customers each day as Chuck and Roy made it their new hangout spot. "They're trying to isolate us," Emily observed one evening, watching through their living room window as a group of neighbors quickly dispersed when Chuck's motorcycle appeared at the end of the street. Buddy and Daisy, usually excited by any outdoor activity, now stayed huddled near the couch, sensing the tension in their home. Jake nodded, his jaw tense. "They're smart about it too. They haven't done anything illegal enough to warrant intervention, but they're making their presence felt." A knock at the door made them both freeze. Jake approached cautiously, relaxing slightly when he saw Mrs. Henderson, their elderly neighbor, through the peephole. He opened the door to find her looking uncharacteristically nervous. "I'm sorry to bother you," she began, wringing her hands, "but I thought you should know. Those two men on motorcycles, they've been asking questions about your schedule when you come and go. They cornered my grandson Tommy when he was delivering newspapers yesterday." Jake invited her inside, exchanging a concerned look with Emily. As Mrs. Henderson settled onto their couch, immediately getting attention from Buddy and Daisy, she continued her story. "Tommy said they were particularly interested in when you're away from home. They tried to make it seem casual, but..." She trailed off, absently petting Daisy, who had settled by her feet. "Thank you for telling us," Emily said softly, sitting beside their neighbor. "Has anyone else mentioned similar encounters?" Mrs. Henderson nodded. "The Martinez family across the street, and I heard they caused quite a scene at Mike's corner store yesterday. Mike had to threaten to call the police before they'd leave." After Mrs. Henderson left, Jake received a call from Officer Thompson, a colleague who regularly patrolled their neighborhood. "Hey, Jake, thought you should know those two troublemakers you asked me to keep an eye on. They've been making waves at several local businesses. Just had to respond to a disturbance at the coffee shop. Nothing we could book them for, but they're definitely pushing boundaries." Jake paced the living room, his mind working through the implications. "They're escalating, trying to show they can affect our daily lives. Have you noticed any pattern to their movements?" "They seem to be mapping out the neighborhood," Thompson replied. "Learning routines, watching traffic patterns. Jake, this feels organized, like they're building up to something." After ending the call, Jake found Emily in their home office, where she'd been working from home more frequently since the troubles began. She looked up as he entered, her expression worried but determined. "I've been thinking," she said, gesturing to her computer screen, where she'd been reviewing their home security footage. "They're not just trying to scare us, they're trying to understand our patterns, our weaknesses." Jake leaned over her shoulder, studying the footage she'd compiled. It showed Chuck and Roy's increasing presence in the neighborhood over the past week, their seemingly random appearances now revealing a clear pattern of surveillance. "Look here," Emily pointed to a timestamp. "They show up every day when our neighbors leave for work. And here, they park near the coffee shop just as the morning rush starts. They're not just intimidating people, they're learning everyone's schedules." Jake felt a mixture of pride in his wife's investigative skills and concern at what she'd uncovered. "They're isolating us by making the neighborhood afraid, while also gathering intelligence for something bigger." A sudden barking from Buddy and Daisy drew their attention to the window. Outside, a motorcycle slowly cruised past their house, the rider making a show of studying their home. Emily reached for Jake's hand, squeezing it tightly. "What are we going to do?" she asked, watching as the motorcycle disappeared around the corner, only to be replaced by another one approaching from the opposite direction. Jake pulled her close, his mind already formulating a plan. "We need to be smart about this. They're trying to make us feel trapped, but they've forgotten one thing. This is our neighborhood, our community. And sometimes the best defense is a united front." As night fell, Jake and Emily could hear the distant rumble of motorcycles circling their neighborhood like sharks in dark water. But instead of feeling helpless, they began to see the situation with new clarity. Chuck and Roy weren't just targeting them anymore. They were affecting an entire community. And in doing so, they might have just made their biggest mistake. Jake's investigative instincts led him to expand his surveillance beyond the physical realm. While monitoring Chuck and Roy's movements in the neighborhood was crucial, he suspected there was more to their strategy than mere intimidation. His suspicions were confirmed when he discovered their activities on social media platforms. "Emily, take a look at this," Jake called from his home office one evening. Emily joined him, leaning over his shoulder to view his computer screen. What they saw was disturbing. Chuck and Roy had been busy building a network of disgruntled individuals, many of whom had their own grievances against the Iron Wolves. "They're creating a coalition," Emily observed, scrolling through various social media posts. "Look at these comments. There are people from all over the area sharing stories about conflicts with the Iron Wolves." Jake nodded grimly. "They're not just looking for sympathy. They're recruiting. Every person with a grudge against the Iron Wolves is a potential ally in their vendetta against us." The online activity revealed a calculated approach that went beyond simple revenge. Chuck and Roy were positioning themselves as victims of the Iron Wolves' supposed tyranny, using their expulsion as a rallying cry for others who felt wronged by the motorcycle club. A message notification popped up on Jake's screen, another contact from the force-sharing intelligence. "You need to see this," the message read, followed by screenshots of private group conversations. Chuck and Roy weren't just gathering supporters, they were organizing them. "They're smarter than we gave them credit for," Jake muttered, analyzing the information. "By linking their personal vendetta against us with others' grievances against the Iron Wolves, they're building something bigger than themselves." Emily, who had been quiet for a moment, suddenly pointed to a particular thread of comments. "Jake, look at this. They're not just targeting us anymore. They're planning to use what happens to us as a way to damage the Iron Wolves' reputation." The strategy became clearer as they dug deeper. Chuck and Roy were crafting a narrative that would turn their revenge against Jake's family into a symbolic act of rebellion against the Iron Wolves. They were transforming their personal humiliation into a cause that others could rally behind. Buddy and Daisy's sudden barking drew their attention to the window. Outside, a car they didn't recognize was parked across the street, its occupants clearly watching their house. Emily instinctively reached for her phone to document the surveillance, but Jake stopped her. "Wait," he said softly, "let them think we haven't noticed. The more they believe they're in control, the more likely they are to make a mistake." The car remained parked there for another hour before finally driving away, but its presence had sent a clear message. The online organizing was transitioning into real-world action. Later that evening, as Emily prepared dinner with Buddy and Daisy hovering hopefully around the kitchen, Jake received an anonymous message. "Watch your back. They're armed and planning something big." The warning confirmed what Jake had already suspected. Chuck and Roy's campaign of intimidation was building toward a climax. The question was no longer if they would make their move, but when and how. "We need to be prepared," Jake told Emily as they sat down to dinner. "They're not just two angry ex-bikers anymore. They're building an operation, and they're patient enough to do it right." Emily reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "But they don't know everything about us, do they? They might be watching our house, following our routines, but they don't know about your resources, your training." Jake smiled slightly, reminded once again of his wife's sharp intuition. "You're right. They think they're dealing with a regular family they can intimidate. They don't realize they're playing a game where we can see all the pieces." As night fell, Jake and Emily reviewed their security measures one more time. The cameras were positioned strategically, the alarms were set, and their trusted neighbors were on alert for any suspicious activity. But more importantly, they had information. Knowledge of Chuck and Roy's plans that the two men didn't realize they possessed. "Whatever they're planning," Jake said as they prepared for bed. Buddy and Daisy already curled up in their usual spots. "We'll be ready. Sometimes the best defense is knowing your enemy's next move before they make it." What Chuck and Roy didn't realize was that while they were building their network of allies, Jake was quietly assembling his own resources. The next moves in this dangerous game would require careful strategy, and Jake was determined to stay several steps ahead of their adversaries. The morning light had barely touched the horizon when Emily spotted it, a dark sedan with tinted windows, parked just within view of their front door. The occupants were clearly visible this time, unknown faces watching their house with unsettling intensity. This wasn't Chuck and Roy's usual drive-by intimidation. This was something more organized. "Jake," Emily called softly, trying not to alert the observers that they'd been spotted. Jake joined her at the window, his expression hardening as he assessed the situation. "They're getting bolder," he observed, noting how the car's position gave its occupants a clear view of both their front door and the side entrance. "This is different from their usual tactics." Emily hugged herself, watching as Buddy and Daisy paced nervously near the door, sensing the tension in the air. They're not even trying to hide anymore. It's like they want us to know they're watching. Jake's phone buzzed with a message from one of his police contacts. Multiple reports of suspicious vehicles in your area, all with connections to known associates of CNR. Be careful. The situation was escalating faster than anticipated. Jake knew they needed to adjust their strategy. With determined steps, he headed to his office, Emily following close behind. "I need to contact Pri again," Jake announced, already reaching for his phone. Emily's surprise was evident. They hadn't expected to need the Iron Wolves leader's help again after the initial confrontation. "Are you sure that's wise?" Emily asked, concern evident in her voice. Last time was about internal club discipline," Jake interrupted gently. "This is different. Chuck and Roy aren't just targeting us anymore. They're using this situation to attack the Iron Wolves' reputation. Pri needs to know." The call to Pri was tense but productive. Despite the initial mistrust between them, both men recognized the growing threat that Chuck and Roy represented. Pri's voice carried a note of genuine concern when Jake described the organized surveillance and the online campaign against both his family and the club. "They're playing a dangerous game," Pri growled over the phone, "using your family to get to us, using us to justify their actions against you. This ends now." After the call, Jake explained the situation to Emily. "Pri's agreed to help. He's got people he trusts who can keep an eye on things. Work with us to stop whatever Chuck and Roy are planning." Emily sat on the edge of their desk, processing this new development. "Can we trust him? The Iron Wolves aren't exactly known for their community service." "Right now our interests align," Jake replied, moving to stand beside her. "Chuck and Roy are threatening both our family and the club's stability. Pri may be many things, but he's smart enough to recognize when he needs allies." Throughout the day, they noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood. The suspicious sedan disappeared, replaced by occasional passes of motorcycles bearing the Iron Wolves' colors. But these riders weren't threatening. They were watching, protecting, their presence a clear message to Chuck and Roy's allies. As evening approached, Jake received another message, this time from Pri. "My people spotted them meeting with others at an old warehouse. They're planning something big. Time to end this." Jake shared the information with Emily, who had been working on compiling all their evidence of Chuck and Roy's escalating behavior. "We need to be ready," she said, determination replacing fear in her voice. "Whatever they're planning, we'll face it together." That night, as they secured their home and checked on the sleeping dogs, Jake and Emily discussed their next steps. The alliance with Pri and the Iron Wolves had changed the dynamic, but it had also raised the stakes. Chuck and Roy would be desperate now, knowing they were losing their advantage. "We need to be smarter than them," Emily said, reviewing their security footage one last time before bed. "They're expecting us to be scared, to make mistakes. We need to use that against them." Jake nodded, pulling her close. "They think they're the ones setting the trap, but they don't realize they're walking into one themselves. Between our preparation and Pri's support, we're finally in a position to end this." As they settled in for the night, the distant sound of motorcycles provided an unusual comfort. Iron Wolves members patrolling the neighborhood, keeping watch. The unlikely alliance between Jake's family and the motorcycle club had shifted the balance of power, but it had also created new complications. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time since this ordeal began, they weren't facing them alone. The question now wasn't whether they could protect themselves, but how to turn Chuck and Roy's own plans against them. The breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday morning. Jake's phone lit up with an urgent message from one of Pri's trusted members. Several motorcycles belonging to the Iron Wolves had been found sabotaged, with clear signs of deliberate tampering. But what caught Jake's attention wasn't the vandalism itself, it was the location. "The bikes were found near that abandoned storage facility on Mason Street," Jake explained to Emily, as they sat in their kitchen, Buddy and Daisy lounging nearby. But here's the interesting part. Security cameras in the area caught Chuck and Roy making multiple visits to that same facility over the past week. Emily leaned forward, her investigative instincts matching her husband's. "You think they're using it as some kind of base?" "More than that," Jake replied, spreading out several photographs on the table. "Look at these. They've been moving equipment in and out, always late at night, and see this?" He pointed to a particular image. That's not their usual crew. These are new faces. The photos revealed a pattern of activity that went beyond simple vandalism. Chuck and Roy weren't just damaging motorcycles, they were creating an elaborate scene, piece by piece. A call from Pre confirmed Jake's suspicions. My people found something else. Pre's gruff voice came through the speaker. Tools used to sabotage the bikes, with Iron Wolves markings. They're trying to make it look like an inside job. Jake's mind raced through the implications. They're not just trying to harm the club, they're trying to create conflict within it, make it look like there's internal sabotage. But why? Emily asked, studying the photos. What does that accomplish? Before Jake could answer, another set of images arrived on his phone. These showed Chuck and Roy meeting with someone in a parking lot, exchanging what appeared to be documents. Jake zoomed in on one particular shot, his expression growing serious. They're planting evidence, he said quietly. Look at these papers. They're made to look like internal Iron Wolves documents. They're creating a paper trail. Emily gasped as understanding dawned. They're not just trying to damage the club's reputation, they're trying to frame them for something bigger. And by extension, frame you. Jake nodded grimly. They're setting up an elaborate trap. The sabotaged bikes, the fake documents, all of it leading to that storage facility. They want to draw us there. As they discussed the implications, Buddy suddenly perked up, letting out a low growl. Through the window, they spotted a familiar car driving past their house, one of Chuck and Roy's new associates. They're watching to see if we've figured it out, Emily observed, moving away from the window. They want to know if we'll take the bait. Jake's phone buzzed again, this time with a message from one of his police contacts. Anonymous tip came in about suspicious activity at the storage facility. They're trying to force our hand. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. Chuck and Roy weren't just seeking revenge. They were orchestrating a complex plan to discredit both Jake and the Iron Wolves. The abandoned storage facility was meant to be the stage for their final act. We need to warn Pre, Emily said, already reaching for her phone. If they're trying to frame the club, his people could be walking into a trap. Jake held up a hand, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. Wait, maybe we can use this to our advantage. They think they're setting the perfect trap, but they don't realize we've uncovered their plan. Emily caught on quickly, her eyes lighting up with understanding. If they think their plan is still secret, then we can turn their own trap against them, Jake finished. But we need to be careful. One wrong move, and we could play right into their hands. As they began to formulate their counter-strategy, Jake received another message from Pre. My people found more tampered bikes. They're getting impatient, pushing harder. Whatever they're planning, it's happening soon. The rain continued to fall outside, creating a somber backdrop to their planning session. Chuck and Roy had spent weeks setting up their elaborate scheme, but they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated the combined resources and intelligence of their opponents. We need to move carefully, Jake told Emily as they reviewed their evidence. They've put too much work into this plan to give up easily. When they realize their trap isn't working as intended, they'll get desperate. Emily nodded, her expression determined. Then we need to be ready for that desperation, because that's when they'll be most dangerous and most likely to make mistakes. The next few days were a delicate dance of surveillance and counter-surveillance. Jake and Emily maintained their regular routines, giving Chuck and Roy's watchers exactly what they expected to see. Meanwhile, they were quietly coordinating with pre-entrusted law enforcement colleagues, setting up their own network of observers. They're getting anxious, Emily noted one morning, watching through their kitchen window as another unfamiliar car drove past their house. Buddy and Daisy lay at her feet, now well trained to remain quiet when strangers approached. Their patrols are more frequent, less careful about being spotted. Jake nodded, reviewing the latest reports from his contacts. They think we're still in the dark about their plan. The more time passes without us reacting to their planted evidence, the more they'll push to force our hand. A message from Pre confirmed their observations. My people spotted them adding more evidence to the storage facility. They're building towards something big, getting sloppy in their rush. The sloppiness was exactly what Jake had been waiting for. Each hasty move by Chuck and Roy revealed more about their ultimate plan. The sabotaged motorcycles, the planted documents, the strategic positioning of their allies around the neighborhood. It all pointed to an elaborate scheme designed to trap both Jake and the Iron Wolves in a compromising situation. "Look at this," Emily called from their home office where she'd been monitoring social media activity. "They're starting to spread rumors online about suspicious activities at the storage facility. They're trying to create witnesses before anything even happens." Jake leaned over her shoulder, studying the carefully orchestrated social media campaign. "They're building a narrative. When they spring their trap, they want plenty of people ready to believe whatever story they tell." Their planning session was interrupted by an urgent call from Officer Thompson. "Jake, you need to hear this. We just got multiple calls about suspicious activity at your house. Calls from people we've never heard from before, all telling the same story about seeing strange movements around your property." They're laying the groundwork, Jake realized. Creating a paper trail of suspicious activity around us before they make their move. Emily's expression hardened as she pulled up their security camera feeds. They're trying to make sure that whatever happens, all evidence will point to exactly what they want people to believe. As they discussed their next moves, Buddy suddenly raised his head, ears perked. Moments later, they heard the distinctive sound of motorcycles approaching, not the threatening roar of Chuck and Roy's bikes, but the more disciplined rumble of Iron Wolves riders. Pre had positioned his most trusted members strategically around the neighborhood, maintaining a visible presence while gathering intelligence. The alliance between Jake's family and the motorcycle club had evolved into a sophisticated operation, with both sides contributing their unique resources and expertise. "We need to be ready," Jake told Emily as they reviewed their security measures. "They're going to make their move soon, and when they do, it'll be designed to leave us no good options." Emily nodded, her expression determined. "But they don't know that we've seen through their plan. They think they're dealing with a regular family and a motorcycle club. They have no idea they're up against people who can anticipate their every move." As night fell, Jake received another message from Pre. "My people intercepted some interesting chatter. They're planning something for tomorrow night. Something about using your dogs to force a confrontation." Jake's jaw tightened as he shared the information with Emily. The mention of Buddy and Daisy made the threat more personal, more immediate. Chuck and Roy were planning to use their beloved pets as pawns in their scheme. "They think the dogs are our weakness," Emily said, watching as Buddy and Daisy dozed peacefully in their favorite spots. "They don't realize they're actually our early warning system." Jake smiled grimly. "They've spent all this time studying our routines, our habits, trying to find the perfect way to trap us. But they've missed the most important thing. We've been studying them right back." As they prepared for bed that night, the pieces of their counter-strategy were falling into place. Chuck and Roy had crafted what they thought was the perfect trap, but their desperation to spring it was making them careless. And in their rush to create an elaborate scheme, they'd overlooked one crucial detail. Sometimes the best trap is the one your target helps you build. The tension in the air was palpable as Jake and Emily spent the evening reviewing their security measures one final time. Their latest intelligence suggested that Chuck and Roy were mobilizing their allies for what they hoped would be their decisive move. "They've been moving equipment into the industrial warehouse all afternoon," Pre reported over the phone. "My people counted at least 6 different vehicles coming and going. They're staging something big." Emily, who had been monitoring their home security feeds, noticed a pattern emerging. "The surveillance cars are pulling back," she observed, pointing to the camera displays. "They're trying to make us feel like the pressure's off." Jake nodded grimly. "They want us to lower our guard. Make us think we've won." He paused, studying the footage from earlier in the day. "But look here, they've positioned new observers, ones we haven't seen before. They're being more subtle about it." Buddy and Daisy, usually content to lounge around the house, had been unusually alert throughout the day. Their heightened awareness wasn't lost on Jake, who had come to trust the dog's instincts during this ordeal. "They sense something's coming," Emily said, watching as Buddy stood guard by the window, his ears perked at every passing sound. Daisy had taken up position near the back door, equally vigilant. A message from Officer Thompson added another piece to the puzzle. "Just got word. Chuck and Roy were spotted buying supplies at the hardware store, industrial-grade locks, chains, and some electronic equipment. Whatever they're planning, they want to control access." Jake shared the information with Pre, who had his own update to offer. "We found more sabotaged bikes near the industrial area. They're trying to create a trail, make it look like there's a pattern of Iron Wolves activity in that sector. As they pieced together the information, Emily noticed something on their security footage. "Jake, look at this," she called, rewinding the video. "That car that passed by an hour ago, the driver was filming our house." Jake studied the footage carefully. They're documenting everything, building their narrative piece by piece. He turned to Emily, his expression serious. "They're not just planning to trap us, they're planning to control how everything looks afterward." The evening wore on, and reports continued to come in from their network of allies. Chuck and Roy's preparations were extensive, suggesting they had been planning this for longer than anyone had suspected. "They've thought of everything," Emily mused, reviewing their collected intelligence. "The sabotaged bikes, the fake documents, the staged evidence at the storage facility, and now this warehouse setup. It's like they're directing a movie where they control all the scenes." Jake's phone buzzed with another message from Pri. "New information. They've been spreading word about a big Iron Wolves gathering at the warehouse tomorrow night, trying to create witnesses for whatever they're planning. They want an audience," Jake realized. "People who will see exactly what Chuck and Roy want them to see, and then spread their version of events." Emily's expression hardened as she reached for her tablet. "Then maybe it's time we gave them an audience they're not expecting." As they finalized their preparations, Buddy and Daisy suddenly became agitated, both dogs moving to the front window with alert postures. Outside, they could hear the distant rumble of motorcycles. Not the usual Iron Wolves patrols, but a different sound altogether. "They're doing a final reconnaissance," Jake observed, watching as several bikes passed by their house, their riders carefully observing everything. "Tomorrow's the day. They'll try to use Buddy and Daisy to draw us out, thinking they're our weakness." Emily reached down to scratch behind Buddy's ears, calming the vigilant dog. "They've spent all this time studying us, planning their trap, but they've missed something crucial." Jake nodded, understanding what she meant. "They think they know every move we'll make, every reaction we'll have, but they've forgotten one important thing. Sometimes the best way to deal with a trap is to spring it on your own terms." As night settled over their neighborhood, Jake and Emily made their final preparations. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation that Chuck and Roy had been meticulously planning, but not in the way they expected. The trap they had so carefully set was about to become their own undoing. The morning dawned with an eerie calm that Jake and Emily knew was merely the quiet before the storm. Their security cameras had captured increased activity around the industrial warehouse throughout the night, Chuck and Roy's people making their final preparations. "They've installed something near the warehouse entrance," Emily noted, studying the footage they'd received from Pri's surveillance team. "Looks like cameras, maybe motion sensors." Jake leaned in to examine the grainy images. "They want to control every aspect of what happens inside that warehouse. They're creating their own stage for whatever show they're planning to put on." Their morning routine was interrupted by an urgent call from Officer Thompson. "Jake, you need to know. We've been getting calls all morning about suspicious Iron Wolves activity near your neighborhood. Different callers, but all telling suspiciously similar stories." "They're building their narrative," Jake replied, exchanging knowing looks with Emily, "making sure there are plenty of witnesses to back up whatever story they're planning to tell." Emily, who had been monitoring social media, noticed a surge in online activity. "Look at this. There are posts appearing about trouble brewing between local residents and the Iron Wolves. They're trying to create tension, make people expect something to happen." Buddy and Daisy's sudden barking drew their attention to the front window. A car they recognized as belonging to one of Chuck and Roy's new allies drove past slowly, the driver making no attempt to hide his surveillance. "They're getting bolder," Emily observed, watching as the car made another pass. "They want us to know they're watching." Jake's phone buzzed with a message from Pri. "My people spotted them moving more equipment into the warehouse. They've set up some kind of control room. Whatever they're planning, they want to manage every detail." As they discussed their next moves, Buddy suddenly raised his head, ears perked in attention. Moments later, they heard it, the distinctive sound of motorcycles approaching, but something was different about the pattern. "That's not the Iron Wolves," Jake said, moving to check the security cameras. "The timing's off. They're trying to imitate the patrol patterns we've gotten used to." Emily pulled up the camera feeds on her tablet. "Look, they're staying just at the edge of our camera range. They know where our security system's blind spots are." The morning progressed with a series of similar probing actions. Cars would drive by, motorcycles would circle the neighborhood, all carefully orchestrated to create an atmosphere of mounting tension. "They think they're wearing us down," Jake commented, watching another unfamiliar vehicle pass their house. "Making us anxious, waiting for their next move." A new message from Pri added another piece to the puzzle. "Just intercepted some interesting chatter. They're planning to use the dogs as bait, thinking you'll react emotionally if they threaten them." Emily's expression hardened as she looked at Buddy and Daisy, both dogs maintaining their vigilant watch by the windows. "They really don't understand, do they? The dogs aren't our weakness, they're part of our strength." As noon approached, they received another update from their surveillance network. Chuck and Roy had been spotted meeting with their core group at a local diner, going over what appeared to be final preparations. "They're getting ready to make their move," Jake said, reviewing the latest intelligence. "But they're so focused on their elaborate plan, they haven't realized we've been 3 steps ahead of them the whole time." Emily nodded, her expression determined. "They think they're directing this whole show, but they don't realize they're not the only ones who can set a stage." The afternoon brought more subtle signs of the impending confrontation. Their neighbors reported unusual activity, strangers asking questions about Jake and Emily, people photographing their house from parked cars, all building towards something. "They're trying to make us feel surrounded," Jake observed, watching another unfamiliar face pass by their house. "But what they don't realize is that every move they make tells us more about their plan." As evening approached, Jake and Emily finalized their own preparations. Chuck and Roy had spent weeks crafting their trap, thinking they were the puppet masters pulling all the strings. But they had overlooked something crucial. Sometimes the most effective counter to a trap isn't avoiding it, but knowing exactly how it works and using that knowledge to turn it against its creators. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across their neighborhood as Jake and Emily made their final preparations. Their security system had captured a steady stream of suspicious vehicles throughout the day, each one part of Chuck and Roy's elaborate surveillance network. "They're positioning their people all around the warehouse district," Pri reported during their latest check-in. "Setting up observation points, coordinating with their allies. They think they're being subtle about it." Emily, who had been monitoring their security feeds, noticed a pattern emerging in the movements. "Look at this," she said, gesturing to her tablet. "They're creating a perimeter, but they're leaving specific routes open. They're trying to funnel us toward the warehouse." Jake studied the pattern she'd identified. "They're not just setting a trap. They're trying to choreograph every movement. They want to control exactly how and when we arrive." Their planning session was interrupted by a sudden commotion outside. Buddy and Daisy rushed to the window, barking urgently. Through the security cameras, they watched as a group of motorcycles circled their block, their riders making a show of studying their house. "That's new," Emily observed, noting how the riders were positioned. "They're not trying to intimidate us anymore. They're sending a message. They want us to know they're ready." Jake's phone buzzed with an update from Officer Thompson. "Just got reports of suspicious activity at that abandoned storage facility. Multiple witnesses claiming they saw Iron Wolves members causing trouble. The stories are too coordinated to be coincidental." "They're creating their backdrop," Jake said, sharing the information with Emily. "Setting up multiple locations to make their story more convincing. The storage facility, the warehouse, they're building layers to their deception." Pri's next message confirmed their suspicions. "My people spotted them moving some final equipment into the warehouse. They've set up some kind of viewing area like they're expecting an audience." As evening approached, the activity around their neighborhood intensified. Cars they didn't recognize drove past their house with increasing frequency, each one carrying observers who made no attempt to hide their surveillance. "They want us to feel the pressure," Emily noted, watching another vehicle make its slow pass. "They think if they make us nervous enough, we'll act rashly when they make their move." Buddy and Daisy remained alert, their protective instincts on full display, as they monitored every unusual sound and movement. Their behavior hadn't gone unnoticed by Chuck and Roy's surveillance team, who seemed to be paying particular attention to the dogs' reactions. "They're studying Buddy and Daisy," Jake observed, watching through their security feeds. "They think they found our weakness, but they don't realize they're showing us exactly what they're planning." A final message from Pri added the last piece to their understanding. "They've got people positioned near every exit point around the warehouse. They think they're setting up the perfect trap, but they're so focused on their plan, they haven't noticed my people tracking their every move. Emily pulled up their neighborhood map, now marked with the locations of all known observers. Look at how they've arranged everything. They're not just trying to trap us. They're trying to create a show, something they can use to discredit both you and the Iron Wolves. Jake nodded, his expression determined. They've spent so much time planning this performance, making sure every detail is perfect. But they've forgotten something crucial about putting on a show. What's that? Emily asked, though the slight smile on her face suggested she already knew the answer. The best performances, Jake replied, checking their own preparations one final time, are the ones where the audience doesn't realize they're watching exactly what the real director intended them to see. As night began to fall, Jake and Emily could feel the tension building toward its inevitable climax. Chuck and Roy had crafted what they believed was an inescapable trap, but in their focus on creating the perfect scheme, they'd missed the most important detail. Sometimes the most effective counter to a complex plan is making your opponents think they're in control, right until the moment they realize they never were. Night had fallen over the city when Jake and Emily received the signal they'd been waiting for. Their security system detected unusual movement patterns around their property. Chuck and Roy's team was making their final preparations. They're starting to move their pieces into position, Pree's voice crackled over the secure line they'd established. My people have counted at least 8 different vehicles converging on the warehouse area. They're trying to make it look like Iron Wolves activity. Emily, monitoring their network of surveillance cameras, noticed the subtle shift in patterns. The regular patrols have stopped, she observed, pointing to the footage. They're clearing the streets, creating a direct route to the warehouse. Jake studied the security feeds, noting how their opponents had positioned their forces. They think they're herding us exactly where they want us to go. Every route except the one to the warehouse is being blocked off. Buddy and Daisy, who had been restless all evening, suddenly became more alert. Their behavior confirmed what Jake and Emily already knew. Chuck and Roy's team was getting closer, preparing to implement the next phase of their plan. Look at this, Emily said, pulling up footage from their neighbor's security camera. They're positioning people in civilian clothes, making it look like concerned residents gathering to witness something. They're creating their audience. A message from Officer Thompson added another layer to their understanding. Just got word. They've started spreading rumors about a big confrontation brewing between the Iron Wolves and local residents. They're trying to draw attention to the warehouse district. Jake's phone buzzed with an update from Pree. My people spotted them testing some kind of lighting system inside the warehouse. They're setting up their stage, making sure everything looks exactly how they want it to. As they watched through their security network, more pieces of Chuck and Roy's plan became clear. Cars were being strategically parked to block certain streets, creating natural barriers that would force any response to follow their predetermined route. They're not just setting up a trap, Jake observed, watching the coordinated movements. They're creating a whole scenario complete with witnesses and evidence. They want to control every aspect of what happens next. Emily pulled up the latest satellite view of the warehouse district. Look at how they've arranged everything. They've created choke points here and here. She pointed to specific locations. They think they're forcing us to play by their rules. Buddy and Daisy's sudden focused attention toward their back door made Jake and Emily freeze. Through their security cameras, they spotted movement in the shadows of their yard, someone testing their home's vulnerabilities. They're getting impatient, Emily whispered, watching as the figure retreated into the darkness. They want to force our hand, make us react emotionally. Jake's phone lit up with another message from Pree. Final pieces are moving into place. They've got people with cameras ready to document everything. They think they're about to capture their perfect moment. The tension in the air was palpable as Jake and Emily made their final preparations. They had watched Chuck and Roy's elaborate plan unfold over weeks, seen how carefully they'd orchestrated every detail. Now, as the confrontation approached, it was time to show them the flaw in their perfect plan. They think they know exactly how this is going to play out, Jake said, checking their own preparations one last time. They've planned for every contingency, every possible reaction we might have. Emily nodded, her expression determined, but they've made one crucial mistake. They're so focused on controlling every detail, they haven't realized they're not the only ones who've been planning for this moment. As the night deepened, The warehouse district had become unnaturally quiet, like a stage set waiting for the performance to begin. Chuck and Roy had orchestrated what they believed was an inescapable scenario, but they were about to learn an important lesson. Sometimes the most effective response to an elaborate trap isn't trying to avoid it, but being ready to turn it into your own advantage. The warehouse district loomed ahead, its industrial silhouette stark against the night sky. Jake and Emily had received the message they'd been expecting, a carefully crafted threat involving Buddy and Daisy, designed to draw them out. Chuck and Roy's people had been spotted near their property, making it clear that staying home wasn't an option. "They're moving into their final positions," Pre's voice came through their secure channel. "My people count at least 12 of their associates scattered around the warehouse perimeter. They think they've got every angle covered." Emily, monitoring their tactical feed from their secure position, watched as more players entered the scene. "The concerned citizens are arriving right on schedule," she noted, observing the seemingly random but clearly coordinated appearance of onlookers. "They're building their audience just like we expected." Jake studied the warehouse layout one final time. Through their intelligence network, they'd identified every camera, every sensor, and every position Chuck and Roy had prepared. "They've created quite a stage for their performance," he commented, noting the carefully arranged lighting that would ensure everything would be visible to their planted witnesses. Buddy and Daisy, secure in their protected location, had played their part perfectly. Chuck and Roy's team had observed the dogs' regular patterns, thinking they understood how to use them as leverage. What they hadn't realized was how this predictability had been carefully cultivated over the past weeks. "Movement at the east entrance," Emily reported, watching their surveillance feeds. "They're positioning their camera people. They want to make sure everything is documented from their perspective." A message from Officer Thompson confirmed their observations. "Local social media is lighting up with rumors about trouble at the warehouse. They're building their narrative, making sure people are paying attention." Pre's next update added another piece to the puzzle. "My people spotted their technical team setting up inside their control room. They think they're going to manage every aspect of what happens next." The warehouse itself was illuminated exactly as Chuck and Roy had planned, creating dramatic shadows and highlighting specific areas where they expected the confrontation to unfold. They'd thought of everything, except the possibility that their targets had already anticipated every move. "Look at how they've arranged their people," Emily observed, marking positions on their tactical display. "They've created a clear path to where they want us to go, thinking we have no choice but to follow it." Jake nodded, watching as more pieces of Chuck and Roy's plan fell into place. "They've spent weeks preparing this moment, making sure every detail is perfect. They think they're about to spring their trap." Another update from Pre showed that Chuck and Roy's confidence was growing. "They're already celebrating," he reported. "They think their plan is foolproof." Emily's hand found Jake's as they watched the scene unfold through their network of cameras. "They have no idea, do they?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "They think they're in complete control." The warehouse stood like a stage set for the final act of a play, every element carefully arranged to tell exactly the story Chuck and Roy wanted to tell. They'd created what they believed was the perfect trap, orchestrated every detail to ensure their targets would have no choice but to play their assigned roles. "It's almost impressive," Jake commented, watching as the last pieces of their opponent's plan locked into place. "They've thought of everything they think we might do, prepared for every reaction they expect us to have." Emily's expression was determined as she monitored their own preparations. "But they've forgotten something fundamental about setting traps," she said, her voice steady. "The most dangerous moment isn't when your target is walking into it. It's when you think you've already won," Jake finished, checking their final positions. Chuck and Roy had created their perfect stage, arranged every detail to ensure their victory. But they were about to learn that sometimes the most effective counter to an elaborate plan isn't trying to avoid it. It's letting your opponents believe they're succeeding, right until the moment they realize they've been outmaneuvered from the start. The warehouse interior was exactly as their intelligence had indicated, a carefully orchestrated set designed to tell Chuck and Roy's version of events. The sabotaged motorcycles were positioned prominently, the planted evidence arranged to be easily discovered by their waiting witnesses. "They've got their camera team in position," Emily's voice came through Jake's earpiece as he approached the warehouse's main entrance. Every angle covered, just like they planned. From his position, Jake could see the gathering crowd of concerned citizens, Chuck and Roy's planted audience, ready to witness and spread their carefully crafted narrative. The trap had been meticulously set, every detail arranged to ensure maximum impact. Our people are in position, pre-confirmed through their secure channel. They have no idea we've got the whole perimeter covered. Jake moved forward, following the path Chuck and Roy had so carefully laid out for him. Their surveillance team tracked his every move, cameras recording what they thought would be their moment of triumph. They'd used Buddy and Daisy as bait, thinking the threat to his beloved pets would make Jake reckless, emotional, predictable. "They're taking the bait," one of Chuck's associates reported loudly enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "He's walking right into it." Inside their control room, Chuck and Roy watched through their network of cameras, confident in their perfect plan. They'd thought of everything: the lighting, the angles, the witnesses, the evidence. Every element had been carefully chosen to support their story. "Movement on the west side," Emily reported calmly through the earpiece. "Their backup team is moving into position, just like we anticipated." The warehouse interior was a study in theatrical lighting, shadows carefully arranged to highlight specific areas while keeping others conveniently dark. Chuck and Roy had created their stage, prepared their props, and positioned their actors. They thought they were directing every moment of what was about to unfold. "Main team is in position," Pre's voice confirmed. "Ready on your signal." Jake continued forward, playing his part in their performance. Through the cameras, Chuck and Roy watched with growing satisfaction as their target appeared to walk right into their carefully laid trap. They'd studied his patterns, analyzed his behaviors, planned for every possible reaction. "He's almost at the mark," Roy's voice crackled over their internal communications, unaware that every word was being monitored. Everyone ready for the main event. The warehouse floor stretched out before Jake, each step taking him closer to the center of their elaborate setup. The sabotaged motorcycles gleamed under the strategic lighting, the planted evidence waiting to be discovered at exactly the right moment. "Backup teams are getting anxious," Emily reported, watching through their surveillance network. "They think they're about to witness their perfect plan unfold." Chuck and Roy's confidence was evident in their relaxed postures as they watched the scene through their monitors. They thought they were witnessing the culmination of weeks of planning, the perfect execution of their flawless scheme. "They're so focused on their own plan," Pre observed through the secure channel, "they haven't even noticed how quiet it's gotten outside." Jake reached the center of the warehouse floor, exactly where Chuck and Roy had intended him to be. Their camera team adjusted their positions, ready to capture what they thought would be their moment of victory. "Now," Chuck's voice commanded over their network, signaling their teams to move in. But as their people stepped forward, something unexpected happened. The carefully arranged lighting suddenly shifted, and new figures emerged from the shadows, not where Chuck and Roy had positioned their people, but in entirely different locations. The realization hit Chuck and Roy at the same moment. Their perfect trap had been compromised, but it was too late. While they'd been focusing on managing every detail of their performance, they'd missed the most important aspect of any confrontation, knowing who was really in control. The look of shock on Chuck and Roy's faces was evident as their carefully orchestrated plan began to unravel. The warehouse, which moments ago had been their stage, now revealed itself as something entirely different, a trap of their own making. "All teams in position," Emily's calm voice came through Jake's earpiece. "Every exit secured. Their backup teams have been contained." The planted witnesses, who had been positioned to document Chuck and Roy's version of events, now found themselves facing members of the Iron Wolves and local law enforcement, their cameras and phones documenting a very different story than the one they'd been prepared to tell. "Their communication network is down," Pre reported through the secure channel. "My people have control of all access points. They're completely isolated." Chuck and Roy emerged from their control room, their confidence replaced by growing uncertainty as they realized the extent of their miscalculation. They'd spent weeks planning every detail, controlling every variable, only to discover that they'd been outmaneuvered from the start. "I have to admit," Jake addressed them, his voice carrying across the warehouse floor, "you put on quite a show." The sabotaged bikes, the planted evidence, the staged witnesses. It was all very elaborate. Emily's voice provided ongoing updates through his earpiece. Their backup teams are surrendering without resistance. They're realizing the game is over. Chuck stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and disbelief. How did you know? We planned everything perfectly. That was your first mistake, Jake replied calmly. You were so focused on creating the perfect trap, you didn't realize you were being watched the entire time. Every move you made, every piece you positioned, we saw it all. Roy's expression shifted as understanding dawned. The dogs. You knew we'd try to use them. Buddy and Daisy were never your leverage. Emily's voice came through the warehouse speakers, surprising Chuck and Roy. They were our early warning system. Every time you watched them, studied their patterns, you were showing us exactly what you were planning. Pre emerged from the shadows, flanked by his most trusted Iron Wolves members. You tried to destroy everything we've built, he addressed his former members. You thought you could turn the community against us, use this staged confrontation to discredit everyone involved. The warehouse lights came up fully, revealing the true extent of the operation. Where Chuck and Roy had positioned their people, they now found themselves surrounded by a coordinated team of law enforcement and Iron Wolves members. Your planted evidence, Jake continued, gesturing to the sabotaged motorcycles and staged documents. We've been documenting everything since you started moving it in here. Every piece of your plan is now evidence, just not the kind you intended. Chuck and Roy's remaining allies, seeing their leader's plan crumbling, began to distance themselves from the situation. The concerned citizens they'd planted in the crowd quickly dispersed, leaving only the real witnesses, those who had been positioned by Jake's team to document the truth. So you thought you were directing this whole show? Emily's voice came through again. But you forgot something crucial about setting up an elaborate trap. Sometimes the target sees it coming and lets you think you're succeeding, right until the moment everything falls apart. The sound of approaching sirens outside confirmed what Chuck and Roy already knew. Their perfect plan had become their perfect downfall. Every element they'd so carefully arranged to frame others now stood as evidence of their own actions. Pre stepped forward, his expression stern but controlled. You wanted to destroy the Iron Wolves' reputation, turn the community against us. Instead, you've shown everyone exactly who you really are. As law enforcement moved in to handle the situation, Jake watched as Chuck and Roy's elaborate scheme collapsed around them. They'd spent weeks crafting what they thought was an inescapable trap, only to find themselves caught in a web of their own making. You know what your biggest mistake was? Jake addressed them one final time. You thought you were dealing with an ordinary family you could intimidate. You never stopped to consider that while you were watching us, we were watching you right back. The autumn breeze rustled through the park trees once again, but this time there was no tension in the air. Jake and Emily walked their familiar path, Buddy and Daisy trotting happily ahead of them, their routine restored to its peaceful rhythm. It's strange, Emily mused, watching the dogs chase falling leaves. How quickly everything can return to normal. Jake squeezed her hand, reflecting on the events of the past weeks. The warehouse confrontation had resolved more than just their immediate problem. It had revealed unexpected alliances and changed perceptions throughout the community. Pre stopped by the precinct yesterday, Jake mentioned, smiling as Buddy attempted to catch a particularly elusive leaf. The Iron Wolves are working on improving their community relations. They're even organizing a neighborhood watch program. Emily nodded, remembering how the motorcycle club had proved to be unexpected allies. It's funny how things work out. Chuck and Roy thought they could use community fear to their advantage, but they ended up bringing people together instead. The aftermath of the warehouse incident had rippled through the neighborhood in surprising ways. The concerned citizens, who had been planted to spread Chuck and Roy's false narrative, had been replaced by genuine community engagement. The Iron Wolves, far from being ostracized, had found themselves increasingly accepted as legitimate members of the community. Mrs. Henderson told me yesterday that she feels safer now than ever, Emily shared, watching as Daisy paused to accept a gentle pat from a passing jogger, something that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. The regular Iron Wolves patrols have actually become a welcome sight in the neighborhood. Jake watched as their neighbors, who had once hurried indoors at the sound of motorcycles, now waved friendly greetings to the passing riders. The fear and tension that Chuck and Roy had tried to create had backfired, transforming into something they hadn't anticipated: unity. "You know what Pre said," Jake recalled, stopping to let Buddy and Daisy investigate an interesting shrub. "He said this whole thing taught him something important about the club's role in the community. They're talking about organizing a charity ride for the local animal shelter." Emily smiled, remembering how the Iron Wolves had shown particular concern for Buddy and Daisy during the entire ordeal. They're not what everyone assumed they were. Sometimes it takes a crisis to reveal the truth about people. As they completed their walk, they passed the local coffee shop, now a regular stop for both residents and Iron Wolves members. The owner, who had once been intimidated by Chuck and Roy's presence, now kept a special parking area reserved for the motorcycle club's community patrol bikes. "It's about trust," Jake reflected, watching the easy interaction between the diverse group of customers. Chuck and Roy tried to destroy it, but they ended up strengthening it instead. Back home, as Buddy and Daisy settled into their favorite spots in the living room, Jake and Emily took a moment to appreciate the peace they'd worked so hard to protect. The security cameras were still in place, but now they were just one part of a larger community security network, monitored by both law enforcement and Iron Wolves patrols. "We learned something too, didn't we?" Emily said, curling up on the couch with Jake. "About not judging people by appearances, about finding allies in unexpected places." Jake nodded, watching as Buddy dreamed peacefully in his favorite sunspot. Sometimes the strongest communities are built by overcoming challenges together. Chuck and Roy thought they could tear everything apart, but they just showed everyone what we're capable of when we work together. The story of their neighborhood had become something of a local legend, not for the conflict that had threatened to divide it, but for the unlikely alliances and stronger bonds that had emerged. The Iron Wolves had found their place as respected community members, and the residents had discovered that safety and security came not from fear and isolation, but from unity and understanding. As the sun set on another peaceful day, Jake and Emily knew that their neighborhood had emerged stronger from its trial. The dogs dozed contentedly. The distant rumble of motorcycles was now a comforting sound of community protection, and the bonds between neighbors had grown stronger than ever. "You know what's really remarkable?" Emily said softly, watching the last rays of sunlight paint the room in warm colors. "How the very things Chuck and Roy tried to use against us, our dogs, our community, the Iron Wolves, ended up being our greatest strengths." Jake smiled, understanding that some of life's most valuable lessons come from the most unexpected challenges. Their neighborhood had faced its test and emerged not just intact but transformed, proving that sometimes the strongest communities are forged in the moments when someone tries to tear them apart. Dear listeners, we hope you've been moved by this tale of unity, strength, and unexpected alliances. This journey through Jake and Emily's story has shown us how the strongest bonds can emerge from the most challenging situations. To experience more captivating stories that explore the complexities of human relationships and community spirit, click the link to your left for our specially curated playlist. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. Every day we bring you unique narratives that remind us of the power of understanding and coming together. Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. We'd love to hear how this story touched you. Stay tuned for more engaging content that celebrates the triumph of unity over division.